the history of the United States Supreme Court in very, very brief terms is what we're going to be starting with today. We begin at the beginning of the Republic in the late 1700s and around the year 1800. We have the appointment of the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. And Marshall is going to have an incredibly long stint as Chief Justice, well into the 1830s and 40s. So, John Marshall is going to sort of loom over, and his period, like many periods in the court's history, will be named after the Chief Justice. In this case, it will be called the Marshall Court years. Now, during this period of time, Marshall is, and the other justices of the Supreme Court are establishing the role of the Supreme Court itself, particularly with decisions like Marbury versus Madison and others, establishing that the Supreme Court itself is a co-equal branch of government in a way that the Constitution never specified. For example, is a law passed by the legislature, according to constitutional means, and signed by the president, according to constitutional means, that violates the Constitution, constitutional? It was passed by the elected representatives in the legislature. It was signed by the elected president at the head of the executive. But it is possible, the court reasons, for the elected representatives and the elected president to be wrong. And the courts established themselves as a third branch of government who is capable of reviewing the decisions of the other two branches and deciding, are those decisions legitimate, in which case they let them stand? Do they need to be reinterpreted, in which case they send them back? Or do they need to be canceled because there was an error and an unconstitutional approach was approved by law? The courts are also establishing, the Marshall Court, the relationship between the federal government of the United States and the state governments, because all of this is new. So the Marshall Court in basically the very late 1700s, but the early 1800s, is about establishing itself as the third branch of government with the power of judicial review over the actions of the other two branches. And this becomes tradition, it becomes precedent, and this is taken for granted today. Although there are challenges to this, as we'll talk about in the case of Worcester versus Georgia. As the 1800s head towards mid-century, the tensions between the Northern abolitionists of the Whig Party and then later the Republican Party versus the Democrats in the North and the South. The Democrats at this time are a union of big city political machines in New York and Boston up north, but also of plantation owners in the South who owned slaves. And it is not true that simply Southern states protected slavery. Democratic Party, North and South, protected slavery before the Civil War. And the Democratic Party at one point was the only party. This was during the period from roughly the late 18 teens through the 1840s. You have the era of good feeling, followed by the era of Jackson. And in both cases, you have the Democratic-Republican Party, basically the Democratic Party, ruling without a strong opposition party. The Whigs come and go, just as the Federalist Party came and went. But the Democratic-Republicans are basically unchallengeable. As such, the Supreme Court is involved, like every other part of the U.S. government in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, with trying to keep a balance that will preserve the union between free states in the North and the slave states in the South. And the big question about this is, what happens out west? Will out west become free, all of it, or slave, all of it? Or will there be an extension of the southern states and the Mason-Dixon line westward to the Pacific, where slave states are in the Southwest and free states are in the Northwest. And the Supreme Court makes one of its worst decisions by modern lights in 1857 when it basically says once a slave, always a slave in the Dred Scott decision. That a slave who's brought to a free state is still a slave even though they're now living in a free state. This decision and the fact that it's impossible. It is impossible for the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch to continue to preserve a balance when the issue is human slavery. Either it's okay to own people or it's not. Either it's okay for the federal government to come in and say, no, 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 your property is not valid property anymore, or it's not. And both sides were fighting for what they called liberty. The South was fighting for states' rights and the fear of a federal government that if they could take your slaves away, they could take anything from you without your consent. And that's tyranny. That's how the South viewed it. The North viewed it as that's an interesting argument for people who own other people and treat them like property. So this becomes our bloodiest war. During the Reconstruction period in the late 19th century, the court steps back a little bit, and it is very careful to try to preserve its role as a deliberative judiciary looking over big issues. Primarily, it's the U.S. Congress that leads in the Reconstruction period of trying to remake Southern society after the Civil War as non-racist, which ultimately fails. We've talked about that. Because can you impose ideas on a free people by force and have them still be free and have those ideas still be real? And the answer is no. That's the difficult thing about ideas. However, as the 19th century becomes the 20th century, as the 1800s becomes the 1900s, issues are beginning to heat up again. And the United States Supreme Court actually approves many of the progressive era increases of federal power, including basically they back most of the plans by the executive and legislative branch to increase the power of the United States federal government to intervene in the economy and in society for the sake of the public good. However, as the Great Depression hits in the before we do that. Just during and after World War I, there are several key Supreme Court decisions that legitimize espionage and anti-sedition acts, restricting free speech if that speech is going to undermine the war effort. And those are things which later courts will tend to dismantle. But for that time, as we are fighting a World War I, the court does not want people going in and trying to get draftees to people who are conscripted into the military to disobey the law or resist intervention against the Bolsheviks by force. The U.S. Supreme Court gets involved in these decisions. Then, as the Roaring Twenties, a time of boom, becomes the Great Depression, the biggest bust in our history thus far, economically, power changes hands. The Republican administrations of Coolidge and Hoover are replaced by the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a liberal Democrat, and he is going to increase the role of the federal government in the lives of people like never before. Even Woodrow Wilson's reforms are going to seem small compared to what Roosevelt is going to try in the 1930s. At this point, the Supreme Court was largely appointed by Republican presidents who had preceded Roosevelt. And again, there are programs like the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration, which have direct federal involvement in people's paychecks and in people's lives and in business decisions. And again, the Supreme Court says, no, we are not going to allow this. This is an unconstitutional intrusion of the federal government into the lives of the people and into the role that the states normally control. So after winning re-election in 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt famously tries to pack the Supreme Court by increasing its size. His plan is to increase the size of the Supreme Court from 9 justices up to, I think, 15. And since there are a whole new bunch of justices to be appointed, Franklin Roosevelt will appoint them all. And whoever the Senate approves will become new justices. And since the Senate is overwhelmingly liberal Democrat, they're going to probably approve whoever Franklin Roosevelt says. And once this is done, the Supreme Court will do the same thing that the Democrat president and the Democrat House and Senate are doing, which is push New Deal legislation. However, the American people, the American media, who's normally supportive of FDR, the Republicans and Democrats, many Democrats, say, whoa, 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 whoa-y whoa, 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 because the federal government is a delicate balance between 3 branches, and this is an obvious attempt by one party to gain an advantage by distorting and destroying the independence of another co-equal branch of government. Democrats and Republicans push back against President Roosevelt's plan to pack the court, and it's his first real failure in office. The people and the institutions of government say no. So the court protects itself from his attempt to pack the court. We will continue with the court in the era of World War II and the early Cold War, which is the 1940s, next time.